Hello my beautiful cultured pearls. Welcome to Pearline Love Jones. If you are new here, you are stepping into a sanctuary where we serve up powerful stories rooted in love, deep heritage, and the beautiful intersection of African cultures. If you're looking for narratives that celebrate the authenticity of love, diverse traditions, and stories that feel like home, you are exactly where you belong. Before we dive into Ivory and Kwame Mensah's story, take a quick second to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment. The tropical heat of Accra, Ghana, usually felt like a warm embrace, but today it felt suffocating. Inside the walls of their stunning East Legon estate, 33-year-old Ivory stood frozen. Beside her stood her husband of 3 years, Kwame Mensah, 35. Kwame was the brilliant, suave CEO of Mensah Heritage Jewelers, the premier luxury jewelry empire in West Africa. He came from old money, but Ivory hadn't married him for his wealth. A world-renowned graduate gemologist from Bentonville, Arkansas, certified by the GIA, Ivory was a powerhouse in her own right. She had been headhunted by Mensah Heritage to grade their rarest diamonds and colored stones. They had fallen in love over the fire of raw gemstones, marrying in a lavish ceremony that gripped the nation. But that fairy tale shattered in a single afternoon. A woman had marched past their security, screaming that she was carrying Kwame's child. The pregnancy was a desperate lie, but the truth that unraveled was worse. Kwame had been having an affair with her for a year. Heartbroken and deeply humiliated, Ivory didn't stay to hear his excuses. She packed her bags, left Ghana, and filed for divorce. Kwame, blinded by his own privilege, only realized the gravity of what he had lost once she was gone. The jewelry empire felt hollow without the woman who brought the stones to life. He vowed to get her back, hoping he was not already too late. A year later, Ivory was living back in the States trying to rebuild. Still nursing a broken heart, she met Daniel Holmes. He was charming, attentive, and swept her off her feet so fast it made her head spin. Within months they were engaged. While Ivory constantly worried she was moving too fast, her best friend Jordan was downright suspicious. "He's rushing you, Ivory," Jordan warned repeatedly. "He is up to something. Men don't push for marriage this quickly unless they're running away from something, hiding something, or planning something." Jordan's instincts were dead on. Unbeknownst to Ivory, Kwame had hired private investigators to keep tabs on her, desperate for a chance to win her back. When the investigators flagged Daniel, Kwame and Jordan teamed up, putting aside their mutual dislike for one goal: protecting Ivory. What they uncovered was terrifying. Daniel was not a romantic. He was a con artist whose crimes had, on at least 2 occasions, appeared to have lethal consequences. He specifically targeted wealthy women, or women with massive career earnings like Ivory. He would charm them, drain their assets, and disappear. Worse yet, Daniel had been living under 8 different identities, but the most horrifying discovery was buried in 2 police cold case files. 2 of his 5 ex-wives had died in suspicious freak accidents, while the others appeared to have gone into hiding to escape him. One ex-wife, when questioned by police, admitted she was hiding for her life, a calculated decision made after a night of drunken rage, when Daniel had beaten her repeatedly and taunted her with the claim that he could get away with murder because he had done it before. Then he promised she was about to learn he could do it again. For Kwame and Jordan, the discovery did not feel like information, it felt like a countdown. Jordan went cold first, her suspicion hardening into terror as every warning she had ever given Ivory twisted into something far more dangerous than heartbreak. This was not a bad fiancé or a charming liar. This was a predator who had left women dead, missing, or too terrified to use their own names. Kwame felt the fear differently. It hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs as he pictured Ivory alone with Daniel, smiling at a man who had already practiced ruining women before destroying them. Guilt and panic clawed at him in equal measure. He had lost Ivory once through his own betrayal, but the thought of losing her permanently, to a man like Daniel, was unbearable. In that moment, their dislike for each other became irrelevant. Jordan's hands trembled as she reached for her phone, and Kwame's voice turned deadly calm as he ordered his investigators to find Ivory immediately. Neither of them said the worst fear aloud, but it sat between them like a loaded gun. If Daniel realized Ivory knew anything, she might not live long enough to escape him. Kwame and Jordan managed to piece together the 8 fake identities, but before they could uncover the murder allegations, Ivory made discoveries of her own. She noticed significant sums of money vanishing from her accounts. Then a rare, highly valuable, unset blue sapphire she had kept from her grading days went missing. When she looked inside a metal box tucked in the back of Daniel's closet, she found IDs with different names and his face. When Daniel returned to his apartment, Ivory confronted him, holding up the fake IDs and demanding to know where her money and sapphire were. Daniel's charming facade instantly dropped. He denied it at first, but when Ivory threatened to call the police, his eyes went cold. He struck her across the face, knocking her to the ground, and dragged her to the living room, attempting to force her to wire the remainder of her life savings into his offshore accounts. Ivory's cheek burned where he had struck her, but the terror in her chest burned hotter. The living room seemed to tilt around her, the overturned lamp, the glitter of broken glass near the coffee table, the sickening thud of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She tried to push herself backward across the floor, one trembling hand raised between them, but her body would not obey her fast enough. Her fingers shook so badly she could barely feel them. "Daniel, please," she whispered, her voice breaking on his name. "Take the money. Take the sapphire. I won't tell anyone. I swear I won't. Just let me go." Daniel smiled at her as if her fear entertained him. He crouched in front of her, slow and deliberate, close enough that she could smell the liquor on his breath and see the emptiness behind his eyes. "Let you go," he repeated softly, almost tenderly, which made it worse. "Ivory, no one is coming for you." Her breath hitched. He watched the words land and seemed to savor them. "Jordan doesn't know where you are. Kwame is across the world. The police don't even know which name to look for. By the time anyone realizes you're missing, I'll already be someone else." Ivory felt the last thin thread of hope inside her pull tight. She thought of Jordan's warnings, of Kwame's face, of every moment she had ignored the uneasy voice in her gut, and shame crashed through her with the fear. "Please," she begged again, tears spilling freely now. "Daniel, I made a mistake. I should never have confronted you. I should never have touched those IDs. I'll forget everything. I'll disappear. You'll never hear from me again." He grabbed her chin hard, forcing her tear-blurred eyes up to his. "You still don't understand," he said, each word slow and cruel. "I can get away with anything. Fraud, theft, murder." He leaned closer, his voice dropping into a whisper that made her stomach turn. "I've done it twice before." Ivory went completely still. The room seemed to lose all sound except for his breathing. "Those women begged too," he continued, his thumb pressing painfully against her jaw. "They promised silence. They promised money. They promised anything I wanted. And you know what happened?" He smiled wider, cold and empty. "Nothing. No prison. No punishment. No one saved them." A sob broke out of Ivory before she could stop it. She clasped her hands together in front of him, no longer caring how desperate she looked. "Please, Daniel, I don't want to die. I have people who love me. Please don't do this. I'll give you everything. Just let me live." Her voice dissolved into shaking breaths, and inside, panic clawed at her so viciously she could barely think. She wanted her mother, she wanted Jordan, she wanted Kwame. Most of all, she wanted one more chance to listen to the instincts she had buried beneath loneliness and heartbreak. Daniel tilted his head, studying her terror like it was something precious. "That is what they all said," he murmured. Then he rose slowly, towering over her, and Ivory understood with a cold, soul-deep certainty that begging was not softening him. It was feeding him. Back in Accra, the alert came through just after midnight. Kwame was in his study, surrounded by reports from his security team, when Daniel's newest alias triggered 3 separate warnings at once: an attempted international wire transfer from Ivory's account, a passport scan tied to one of Daniel's false names, and then the worst notification of all: Ivory's phone had gone dead. For one frozen second, Kwame could not move. The room, the files, the city lights beyond the glass all seemed to fall away, as one thought slammed through him with brutal clarity: he has her. Then panic turned into command. He was on his feet before the security chief finished speaking, barking orders for the jet to be fueled, for Daniel's location to be locked down, for every contact he had in U.S. law enforcement to be woken up immediately. His hands were steady, but his voice had gone dangerously quiet. He called Jordan from the car on the way to the airport, and when she answered, he heard the same terror in her silence that was tearing through him. "Find her," Jordan said, her voice trembling but fierce. "Kwame, you find her now." He did not waste time promising. He only said, "I am already on my way." The flight felt endless. Kwame spent every minute in motion, on the phone with Jordan, forwarding files to detectives, sending Daniel's aliases, bank records, stolen identity scans, and the cold case links to the authorities moving toward the apartment. Jordan stayed on the line with dispatch, refusing to hang up, her voice cracking only once when she whispered Ivory's name. By the time Kwame landed, his security team had vehicles waiting on the tarmac. He did not wait for protocol. He climbed into the first SUV, tie loosened, jaw locked, eyes fixed straight ahead as the convoy tore through the sleeping streets. At Daniel's building, police were already moving into position, but then a muffled scream cut through the hall from inside the apartment. That sound broke whatever restraint Kwame had left. Before anyone could stop him, he drove his shoulder into the door with the full force of his body. The lock splintered, wood cracked, the door flew inward. Kwame saw everything in a single horrifying flash. Ivory on the floor, pale and shaking. Daniel standing over her, his hand raised again. A sound Kwame did not recognize tore out of his chest. He crossed the room like a storm and slammed into Daniel, driving him hard into the wall and then down to the floor. Daniel cursed and fought, but Kwame pinned him with a fury sharpened by fear, one forearm across his back, one knee locking him in place until the police surged in and pulled him into handcuffs. Even then, Daniel tried to smile, tried to talk his way out, tried to become charming again. But this time there were too many names, too many stolen accounts, too many dead women, and too many officers watching. As they hauled him upright, Kwame leaned close enough for Daniel to hear him over the chaos. "You are finished." Daniel's face finally changed. For the first time, the con man looked afraid. Only after Daniel was dragged away, did Kwame turn back to Ivory. The rage drained from him so quickly it left only terror and tenderness behind. He dropped to his knees in front of her, careful not to touch her until she reached for him first. Ivory's whole body was trembling. Her cheek was swollen, her breath came in broken pulls, and her eyes kept darting toward the doorway as if Daniel might somehow return. When Kwame softly said her name, something inside her finally cracked. She collapsed into his arms with a sob that seemed to come from the deepest place in her, and he held her as gently as if she were made of glass. Jordan arrived soon after, breathless and crying, and the two of them stayed on either side of Ivory while paramedics checked her over and officers took her statement. In the days that followed, the evidence against Daniel multiplied: attempted theft, identity fraud, coercion, stolen property, offshore transfers, kidnapping, assault, and reopened investigations into the suspicious deaths of his ex-wives. The man who had built his life on disappearing was finally trapped by every lie he had ever told. Shaken but alive, Ivory allowed Kwame to take her back to Ghana, not because she had forgiven everything, but because she needed distance, safety, and silence. In Ada Foa, at a private villa overlooking the ocean, the sound of waves replaced the echo of Daniel's threats. She slept behind guarded gates, woke to sea air and sunlight, and began the slow, fragile work of believing she had survived. Over the next 6 months, healing became Ivory's full-time work. At Kwame's gentle encouragement, but never his pressure, she began counseling with a trauma therapist in Accra, sitting week after week in a quiet office with soft lamps, ocean-colored walls, and a box of tissues always within reach. At first, she could barely speak Daniel's name without trembling. Some sessions left her exhausted and hollow, her hands shaking as she relived the sound of his voice, telling her no one was coming. Other days, she was angry, furious at Daniel, furious at herself for missing the signs, and sometimes even furious at Kwame for being the safest place she had to fall after once being the man who broke her heart. Kwame accepted all of it. He drove her to every appointment and waited outside without complaint, never asking what she discussed unless she chose to tell him. On the nights when nightmares dragged her awake, he sat with her on the veranda until sunrise, speaking softly over the crash of the waves and reminding her where she was, who she was, and that Daniel could not reach her anymore. He learned the small things that made her feel safe, leaving lights on in the hallway, standing where she could see the door, asking before he touched her, keeping his voice calm when fear startled her. Slowly, Ivory began to breathe, without bracing for danger. She laughed more, she slept longer, she stopped flinching at sudden noises, and every step of the way, Kwame stayed, not as a rescuer demanding forgiveness, but as a steady presence proving, day by day, that safety could be rebuilt and love did not have to feel like a threat. But while Ivory was learning how to survive what Daniel had done, Kwame was forced to confront the damage that had begun long before Daniel entered her life. Some nights, after Ivory had finally fallen asleep, he stood alone on the dark veranda and let the guilt swallow him whole. If he had not betrayed their marriage, she would never have fled Ghana broken-hearted. She would not have been living in the States, trying to rebuild herself in loneliness. She would not have been vulnerable to a man like Daniel, who had mistaken her pain for weakness and tried to turn it into a weapon. The truth tortured Kwame, because there was no way to soften it. His unfaithfulness had opened the door, and Daniel had walked through it. He carried that knowledge quietly, never using his guilt to demand comfort from her, but it changed the way he loved her. He became patient where he had once been arrogant, humble where he had once been entitled, careful with every word and every touch. Ivory noticed. She tried not to. At first she told herself the warmth in her chest was gratitude, because Kwame had saved her life. Then she told herself it was dependence because trauma made safety feel like love. But gratitude did not explain the way her heart steadied when he entered a room, or the way she missed the sound of his voice when he gave her space, or the quiet ache that rose in her when she saw him carrying his remorse without asking her to absolve him. Slowly, reluctantly, Ivory began to admit the truth to herself. What she felt for Kwame was not only gratitude, it was not only comfort. Beneath the fear, beneath the scars, beneath the careful walls she had built to protect herself, love was still there, wounded, cautious, but alive. Once in Ghana, Kwame did not pressure her. Instead, he showed her the man he had become. He showered her with thoughtful gifts, not just expensive trinkets, but items that held deep sentimental value from their early days. He took her on intentional, quiet dates and romantic trips across the continent, focusing entirely on her healing. During their trip to Elmina, Kwame arranged something intimate, a private dinner served on a secluded wooden deck jutting out over the rocky Atlantic shoreline. The setting was spectacular, but for Kwame, the view faded the moment Ivory stepped out of the resort suite. Ivory wore a striking deep fuchsia silk slip dress that contrasted beautifully with her rich skin tone. The dress featured a low-cut back and a thigh-high slit that moved fluidly with the ocean breeze. She wore her hair up in a sleek, elegant high bun, exposing her long neck, and accessorized simply with a pair of flawless, raw-cut opal drop earrings, a nod to her gemologist roots. When Kwame caught sight of her, his breath caught entirely in his throat. A familiar, powerful ache seized his chest. Seeing her look so breathtaking, yet so fiercely independent, hit him with a wave of profound regret. This was the brilliant, beautiful woman he had foolishly taken for granted. He felt a fierce protective urge rise within him, mixed with a deep humility. He knew he didn't deserve her, but he was willing to spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of her. As Ivory walked toward him, her own heart did a dangerous flutter. Kwame looked devastatingly handsome. He wore a tailored, crisp white linen button-down shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, exposing his broad wrists, paired with dark tailored trousers. The moonlight caught the sharp angles of his jawline and the intense, unwavering devotion in his dark eyes. Seeing him look at her as if she were the only woman in the universe made Ivory's knees weak. A familiar, intoxicating warmth flooded her veins, the undeniable gravitational pull she had always felt toward him. But right alongside that warmth came a sharp, icy prickle of caution. Throughout the dinner, the tension between them was electric. They laughed over shared memories, discussed the rare stones Kwame's company had recently acquired, and drank deep red wine. Kwame's attentiveness was total. He watched her expressions, hung on her every word, and poured his heart out, taking full accountability for the past. As the ambient music from the resort faded, and only the sound of the crashing waves remained, Kwame rose and offered her his hand. Ivory took it, her skin tingling at the contact. He pulled her gently against his chest, his hands settling onto the small of her bare back. They swayed slowly to the rhythm of the ocean. The heat radiating between them was overwhelming. Kwame leaned down, his gaze dropping to her lips. "Ivory," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you. So much." The distance vanished. Kwame closed the gap, pressing his lips to hers. The kiss began with a reverent sweetness, but the moment Ivory's lips parted, a year of suppressed longing, heartbreak and unyielding passion exploded between them. Kwame's grip on her back tightened, pulling her flush against his body, as the kiss turned deep, hungry and demanding. Ivory wrapped her arms around his neck, standing on her tiptoes, completely losing herself in the intoxicating taste of him. For a breathless, dizzying moment, the entire world vanished. Then, reality crashed back in like a tidal wave. A sudden, sharp panic gripped Ivory's chest. The sheer intensity of how much she still loved him, and how easily she was surrendering, absolutely terrified her. "What if he breaks me again?" the voice whispered in her head. "What if this is just the same heartbreak wearing a softer face?" With a sudden gasp, Ivory tore her mouth away from his. She pushed against his broad chest, creating space between them, her breathing ragged and her chest heaving. "I can't," Ivory breathed, her eyes wide with a mixture of desire and raw fear, tears welling at the corners. "Kwame, I can't do this. I am terrified of falling for you again. I can't survive you hurting me a second time." Kwame stumbled back slightly, his own breathing heavy, his lips still tingling from the taste of her. He looked at her flushed face, the panic in her eyes, and the vulnerability radiating from her. A pang of deep sorrow hit him. He had caused that fear. He didn't try to pull her back. He didn't offer defensive arguments. Instead, he dropped his hands, raised them in a gentle gesture of surrender, and gave her a soft, understanding nod. "I understand, Ivory," Kwame said softly, his voice steady despite the pain in his chest. "I did this to us. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." That night, they returned to separate rooms, separated by walls that suddenly felt impossibly thin. Ivory lay on her back beneath the cool sheets, staring into the darkness while the ocean battered the shore beyond her balcony. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt Kwame's hands at the small of her back, the reverence in the way he had kissed her, the restraint in the way he had let her go when fear overtook desire. Her body remembered the safety of him, even while her mind replayed the pain of what he had done. She turned onto her side, pressing a trembling hand to her chest as if she could quiet the ache there. Part of her wanted to run down the hall, knock on his door, and let herself fall into the warmth she had been fighting for months. Another part of her, the wounded part still learning how to trust, whispered that wanting him did not mean she was safe, that love had once broken her badly enough to send her across an ocean. In his own room, Kwame sat on the edge of the bed long after midnight, his shirt unbuttoned, his head bowed, replaying the exact moment panic had filled Ivory's eyes. Desire still burned through him, fierce and undeniable, but guilt burned hotter. He had caused the fear that made her pull away. He had taught the woman he loved to question whether his arms were a refuge or a risk. More than once he stood and walked toward the door, desperate to go to her, to apologize again, to promise again. But each time he stopped himself. Loving her now meant not making his need louder than her healing. Eventually, exhaustion dragged them both under, Ivory with tears drying at her temples, and Kwame with her name still caught behind his teeth. But sleep brought neither of them peace. Ivory dreamed of reaching for him through water she could not cross, and Kwame woke before dawn from the sound of her imagined cry, both of them longing for the same comfort and terrified of what it would cost to claim it. The trip ended, and Ivory returned to her own space. But peace eluded her almost immediately. The quiet that should have comforted her felt too loud, too empty, too aware of everything she was trying not to feel. Her room was familiar, the neatly arranged books, the gemological tools laid out with careful precision, the soft curtains moving in the evening breeze, but nothing inside her felt settled. She unpacked slowly, folding dresses she had worn beside Kwame, and placing them in drawers as if distance alone could fold the memories away with them. But the moment she sat on the edge of the bed, the silence rushed in, and with it came the ache she had been trying to outrun. In the weeks that followed, she found herself completely trapped in her own mind. No matter how hard she tried to focus on her gemology work, the memories slipped in between every task. She would lower her eye to the loupe, intending to study the fire inside a ruby, or the clean symmetry of a diamond, and suddenly she would see the moonlit deck instead. The Atlantic crashing black and silver beneath them, Kwame's hand warm and steady against the bare skin of her back, his voice low and broken when he told her he loved her. She tried to write grading notes, but her pen would still over the page, as the kiss returned in vivid, merciless detail, the first careful brush of his mouth, the moment restraint snapped, the heat of his body against hers, the desperate tenderness in the way he held her, as if he was afraid she might vanish. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt that burning, electric sensation all over again. It played on a loop in her thoughts, the weight of his hands, the rough edge of his breath, the way her own body had answered him, before fear had dragged her back to shore. What haunted her most was not the passion, though that was impossible to forget. It was the absolute safety she had felt in his arms, right before panic stole it from her. She looked around her room at the thoughtful, intentional gifts he had given her, and each one seemed to accuse her of pretending she was untouched. The engraved loop rested on her desk, her initials etched into the handle in the same elegant script he had used on the first note he ever left her years ago. Beside it sat a smooth riverstone he had picked up for her in Ada Foa, because its bands reminded him of agate, a pressed wildflower from Mole National Park tucked carefully between the pages of her journal, and a small carved box he had found from an artisan who specialized in traditional Ghanaian patterns. None of them were extravagant enough to overwhelm her. That was what made them dangerous. They proved he had been paying attention, not to what would impress her, but to what would move her. Every single detail of their time together haunted her in the most beautiful, agonizing way. The way he waited outside her counseling sessions without demanding entry into her pain, the way he kept the hallway lights on after her nightmares, the way he asked before reaching for her, the way he stepped back on the deck, even when desire had been written all over his face. Kwame had proven through his actions, his patience and his restraint, that he was no longer the man who had strayed, and that truth unsettled Ivory more than any apology ever could. She had stopped the kiss out of fear, but as the days bled into weeks, Ivory began to understand that fear was changing shape. At first, it had been the familiar terror of trusting Kwame again, of handing her heart back to the one person who had once shattered it. She questioned every longing, every flutter, every softening inside her. She told herself she missed him because he had rescued her, because he had been kind, because trauma could make safety feel like love. But late at night, when the house was still, and her defenses were too tired to keep lying, the truth rose quietly and refused to leave. She did not only want the man who had saved her from Daniel, she wanted the man who had sat beside her in silence, who had learned the language of her fear, who had loved her enough to stop when she asked him to. The fear of being hurt again was still there, real and sharp, but another fear had begun to grow beside it, larger, heavier, more unbearable. It was the fear of choosing safety so completely that she lost the chance to be loved deeply. The fear of spending the rest of her life remembering Kwame's kiss and wondering what would have happened if she had been brave enough to stay. Slowly, painfully, Ivory realized that the fear of living a life without him was becoming far greater than the fear of letting him back in. Kwame had asked to cook dinner for Ivory. He had spent the past 2 days making sure everything in his home was absolutely flawless. He knew this night was everything. To prepare, he curated a playlist of all her favorite artists, tracking down every song that made her smile. He filled the vases with fire and ice roses, their striking white petals edged in deep, fiery red, exactly the way she loved them. He tracked down bottles of her favorite wine, Baron d'Aragnac, and personally oversaw the kitchen to ensure the menu was perfect. Rich, savory red Ghanaian black-eyed pea stew, with perfectly caramelized fried plantains, and tender, spiced grilled tilapia. He made sure every inch of the house was spotless. When the time came, he sent a private car to bring her to him. When Ivory stepped through his front door, Kwame's entire body revolted at the sheer sight of her, a sudden, violent rush of adrenaline and desire that knocked the wind from his lungs. She wore a simple cream dress that hugged her full curves in all the right places, her hair styled in a perfect, soft halo around her face. As she walked past him, she smelled of warm vanilla and something distinctly sweet, a scent that instantly made his mouth water. They ate dinner, completely lost in each other's company. They spoke about everything, their hopes, fears, and possibilities, the easy rhythm of their old life wrapping around them like a warm blanket. Ivory laughed at his jokes, the sound like music to his ears. Later, as the music drifted through the house, Kwame watched in sheer amusement as Ivory attempted to dance. She tried to do the switch, a popular Ghanaian dance move, which she still absolutely could not do. Her offbeat missteps and playful frustration would have looked ridiculous to anyone else, but to Kwame, she looked like a graceful ballerina. When it became hilariously evident that dancing was not her spiritual gift, they ended up collapsing onto his large, plush sofa, still laughing and breathless, talking about everything and nothing. Gradually, the laughter faded into a charged, heavy silence. Kwame was staring at her with a deep, magnetic intensity that made a crimson blush creep up Ivory's neck. His voice dropped to a low, gravelly register. "I miss this, Ivory. I miss us." Ivory looked at him, her heart thumping wildly against her ribs. She offered a soft, genuine smile. "Yeah, me too." Just then, as if the universe itself wanted to stack the deck entirely in Kwame's favor, the smooth, sultry intro of Eric Benet's Chocolate Legs started playing through the speakers. Everything in the room went dead still. It was as if the very walls were holding their breath, allowing the sensual, aching words of the song to say exactly how much Kwame wanted and needed her. Kwame leaned in, his gaze dropping to her mouth. He kissed her softly, his need for her making him forget his promise to let her lead and to ask for permission. Ivory did not pull away this time. Instead, a soft sigh escaped her, and she responded by wrapping her arms around his neck, pulling him flush against her chest. At her surrender, his passion took over. The kiss instantly shifted, becoming urgent, raw and primal. The sofa felt too small for the sheer magnitude of what was erupting between them. Kwame lifted her effortlessly, his lips never leaving hers as he carried her down the hall to his bedroom, where the scent of vanilla and fire and ice roses lingered in the air. He lowered her onto the bed, coming down over her like a shadow, his hands worshipping every curve the cream dress had hidden. With frantic but deliberate movements, the dress was stripped away, followed quickly by his own clothes, until there were no barriers left between them. The lovemaking was a reclamation. Every press of Kwame's lips against her skin, from the hollow of her throat to the curve of her hip, was an unspoken apology. He moved over her with a fierce, possessive reverence, his eyes locked onto hers in the amber light. "You are my home, Ivory." He groaned against her skin, his hands anchoring her hips to his. "Always you." When he entered her, Ivory gasped, arching her back as a wave of intense, blinding pleasure crashed over her. It was a familiar lock finding its perfect, custom key. Kwame moved with a slow, agonizingly deep rhythm that drove her to the brink of madness, completely attuned to the friction of their bodies and the ragged sound of her breathing. The passion was overwhelming, a turbulent storm of past hurt, present forgiveness, and an undeniable future melting into a singular, sweating, breathless rhythm. Ivory gripped his broad shoulders, her nails digging into his back as she anchored herself to him, completely lost in the beautiful chaos of his touch. They moved together until the tension snapped, shattering them both into 1,000 brilliant pieces, clinging to each other as if they were drowning. Afterward, the room was quiet, save for the steady rhythm of their breathing and the sensual music still playing in the living room. Ivory lay with her head nestled securely in the crook of Kwame's arm, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. Kwame looked down at her, his eyes shining with an emotion so raw it made Ivory's throat tight. He took her hand, kissing her knuckles gently. "I broke the rarest gem I ever held," Kwame said, his voice thick and unwavering. "I am so sorry for the pain I caused you, Ivory. I promise you, on my life and everything I own, I will never do anything to hurt you again. I will spend every day making you feel as safe as you are right now." Looking into his eyes, surrounded by the scent of her favorite roses and the lingering warmth of his skin, Ivory knew the fear was finally gone. The gifts, the dates, the trips, and the memory of his touch had woven themselves into her soul. Smiling through a few happy tears, she leaned up and kissed him softly. "I love you, Kwame." They had survived the storm, and on the ruins of their past, they were finally ready to build something unbreakable.